In the winter of 1943, deep in the occupied territories of Southeast Asia, Japanese military command recorded an unusual incident in their camp logs. A single female prisoner, age 19, had been placed in solitary confinement not for attempting escape, but for something far more dangerous. She refused to bow. This wasn't just disobedience. It was the beginning of a psychological war that would crack the discipline of an entire garrison. What happened next exposed a truth the Imperial Japanese Army never anticipated, that the weakest-looking prisoner could become their greatest threat. And it all started with a girl they underestimated. Her name has been lost to time, buried in destroyed records and faded memories. But the survivors who knew her called her the girl who wouldn't break. She was captured during a resistance operation in the jungles of Burma, one of dozens of local women who'd been aiding Allied forces with intelligence, supplies, and sabotage. The Japanese had grown frustrated with guerrilla attacks in the region, and when they finally traced the network back to a village on the edge of the mountains, they moved swiftly. Soldiers surrounded the settlement at dawn, dragging out anyone suspected of collaboration. She was among them, young, thin, dressed in rough cotton, her hands still dirty from planting rice. The guards barely looked at her twice. To them, she was just another peasant girl, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They expected her to cry, to beg, to collapse under fear like so many others had. She did none of those things. The Japanese military prided itself on discipline. Every soldier, every guard, every officer operated within a rigid hierarchy where orders were absolute and obedience was survival. This system had conquered half of Asia. It had crushed revolts, silenced dissent, and turned occupied populations into compliant subjects. Women, especially, were seen as the easiest to control, culturally conditioned to submit, physically weaker, emotionally fragile. The guards at the camp had processed hundreds of female prisoners before. Most broke within days. The rest learned to stay invisible, to obey without question, to endure in silence. But this girl was different. From the moment she arrived, something in her eyes told them she wasn't going to play by their rules. And that made her dangerous. The camp was located in a valley surrounded by dense jungle, isolated from the nearest town by 2 days' march. It was a place designed to strip away hope. Rows of bamboo barracks, a muddy parade ground, barbed wire fences, and watchtowers manned by soldiers with rifles and nothing but time. The prisoners were a mix. Captured resistance fighters, suspected spies, civilians pulled from raids, and women accused of aiding the enemy. They slept on wooden platforms with no blankets, ate watery rice twice a day, and worked until their hands bled. The Japanese command believed that suffering built obedience. They were wrong. She was shoved off a transport truck along with a dozen other prisoners, their wrists bound with rough rope. The guards lined them up in the center of the camp, shouting commands in Japanese that most didn't understand. The message was clear anyway. Stand straight, eyes down, don't move. A sergeant walked down the line, inspecting each prisoner like livestock. When he reached her, he stopped. She was staring directly at him. Not in anger, not in fear, just looking. He barked an order. She didn't flinch. He repeated it, louder this time, stepping closer. Still, she didn't move. The other prisoners held their breath. One of the guards raised his rifle but, ready to strike. The sergeant held up a hand, stopping him. Instead, he smiled, a cold, predatory smile. He'd seen defiance before. It never lasted long. That first night, they put her in a barracks with 30 other women. The space was suffocating. Low ceiling, dirt floor, the air thick with the smell of sweat and sickness. Most of the prisoners had been there for months, some for over a year. They moved like ghosts, conserving energy, speaking only in whispers. One of the older women, a schoolteacher from Rangoon, leaned close and gave her the only advice that mattered. Keep your head down. Don't look at them. Don't speak unless spoken to. If you resist, they will make an example of you. The girl nodded, but she didn't agree. She'd already decided that survival wasn't enough. If she was going to die here, she would die on her own terms. The Japanese ran their camps like military units. Every morning at dawn, prisoners were forced to line up for roll call, standing at attention while guards counted heads and inspected their appearance. Any sign of weakness, slouching, trembling, looking away, was met with punishment. A slap across the face, a kick to the ribs, hours standing in the sun without water. The guards didn't need a reason. Punishment was a tool, and they used it liberally. The goal was simple: break the spirit and the body would follow. But she refused to be broken. On her third day, during roll call, a guard noticed she wasn't standing exactly as ordered. Her feet were too wide apart, her posture too relaxed. He screamed at her in Japanese, gesturing frantically. She didn't move. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back. She still didn't react. The other prisoners watched in horror, certain she was about to be beaten senseless. Instead, the guard let go and walked away, muttering something under his breath. The other women didn't understand what had just happened. Neither did the guards. She'd done something unthinkable. She'd made them hesitate. The camp's discipline system relied on predictability. Prisoners were supposed to react to fear. They cried, they begged, they cowered. That reaction reinforced the guard's sense of control. But when she didn't give them that reaction, it disrupted the entire psychological structure. The guards didn't know how to process a prisoner who wouldn't play the role of victim, so they escalated. Forced labor was the camp's primary tool of exhaustion. Prisoners were sent into the jungle to cut timber, haul stones, dig trenches, or build roads for the Japanese supply lines. The work was brutal, especially for women who'd spent their lives farming or teaching, not hauling logs in the tropical heat. Many collapsed within hours. Some never got back up. The guards didn't care. There were always more prisoners to replace the ones who died. But she didn't collapse. She worked slowly, deliberately, conserving her strength. And when the guards screamed at her to move faster, she met their eyes and kept working at the same pace. It was a small act of defiance, but it was enough to infuriate them. One afternoon, a guard decided to make an example of her. He ordered her to stand in the center of the camp, arms raised above her head, holding a heavy stone. The punishment was common, meant to exhaust the prisoner until their arms gave out and they collapsed in humiliation. Most lasted an hour, maybe two. She stood there for 6. By the time the sun began to set, her arms were shaking, her legs trembling, sweat pouring down her face. But she didn't drop the stone. The guards watched, confused and increasingly unsettled. Finally, the same sergeant from her first day walked over and told her to put it down. She lowered the stone carefully, meeting his eyes one last time before walking back to her barracks. That night, the other prisoners looked at her differently. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was resisting. Word spread quickly through the camp. The women in her barracks began to whisper about her. How she refused to bow, how she endured punishments that broke others, how she never gave the guards the satisfaction of seeing her suffer. Some of the prisoners were inspired. Others were terrified, convinced she would bring collective punishment down on all of them. But slowly, something began to shift. Women who had been silent for months started speaking again. They shared scraps of food they'd hidden. They covered for each other during roll call. They stopped seeing themselves as helpless. And the guards noticed. The camp commander, a career officer who prided himself on maintaining order, called a meeting with his subordinates. He'd heard about the girl, about the disruption she was causing. He issued a direct order: break her or remove her permanently. The guards understood. They had one chance to reassert control. Failure wasn't an option. They isolated her from the other prisoners, placing her in a small bamboo cage barely large enough to sit in. No food, no water, no shelter from the sun or the rain. It was a punishment reserved for the worst offenders, designed to kill slowly. Most prisoners lasted 3 days before they begged to be let out. She lasted 7. By the time they dragged her out, she was barely conscious. Her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin burned raw. But when the sergeant asked if she was ready to obey, she looked up at him and smiled. Not a smile of surrender, a smile of victory, because she knew something he didn't. She'd already won. The guards began to change. Some became crueler, desperate to regain the authority they felt slipping away. Others grew quieter, avoiding eye contact with her, as if afraid of what she represented. A few, in moments no one else saw, showed small acts of mercy. A cup of water left within reach, a beating stopped before it went too far. The rigid discipline that had defined the camp was fracturing. And it was all because of one girl who refused to accept the role they'd assigned her. Then came the day everything changed. A new prisoner arrived, a young boy accused of spying for the Allies. He was maybe 14, terrified and crying. The guards decided to make a spectacle of his punishment, dragging him into the center of the camp and preparing to beat him in front of everyone. The prisoners were forced to watch, a reminder of what happened to those who resisted. But before the first blow could land, she stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She just walked out into the open and stood between the boy and the guards. The entire camp went silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sergeant raised his hand to strike her. She didn't flinch. And in that moment, something broke. Not her. Them. The guard lowered his hand. The beating never happened. The boy was sent back to the barracks. And the prisoners realized, for the first time, that the Japanese weren't invincible. That their discipline, their authority, their entire system of control could be disrupted by one person who refused to be afraid. The girl had done what no weapon, no strategy, no military force had managed. She'd made the guards doubt themselves. As the war dragged on, the camp began to fall apart. Supplies dwindled. Orders from command became inconsistent. Guards grew anxious, aware that Japan was losing ground across the Pacific. The prisoners, sensing the shift, became bolder. They stopped obeying meaningless orders. They shared information. They protected each other. And through it all, she remained at the center, not as a leader in the traditional sense, but as a symbol. A reminder that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about refusing to surrender who you were. When Allied forces finally liberated the camp in the summer of 1945, they found fewer than half the original prisoners still alive. The survivors were emaciated, sick, traumatized, but they were alive, and many of them credited one person with giving them the strength to hold on. The girl who wouldn't bow. The girl who broke their captors' discipline not with violence, but with will. Her name may be lost, but her story remains. A testament to the power of one human being to resist, to endure, and to prove that even the most ruthless systems of control can be shaken by someone who simply refuses to break. And that refusal, quiet and unrelenting, became a legacy that outlasted the empire that tried to destroy it. If you're watching this, drop a comment and tell us where you're from. History isn't just about the past. It's about remembering the people who refused to be forgotten.